Hello! So you want to learn how to paint with watercolors? Let's start then. Before we begin painting, let me give you an overview of the materials we need. We will need some kind of watercolor paper, whether that's a sketchbook, a glued pad or a loose sheet. Regular copy paper does not work for watercolors. Since it will not absorb the colors at all, it will bleed through, will get way too wavy and eventually even rip. We will need our paints. Watercolors can be bought in tubes or pans. Just buy what you think you prefer. The result is the same. For the purpose of this video, I will show you how to use both. Now we will need some brushes. There are lots of different brushes that you can use for various techniques and purposes. For starters, one of those fluffy round brushes is all you need. We will also need a glass or jar that we will fill up with water. Perhaps you can also use two glasses. One you will use to clean your used brush of any pigments, and the second cleaner one you will use to pick up clean water, so that your painting or the paints that you're currently mixing do not get a different color than you intend. Now let's start with complete basics. If you're using a single sheet of paper, make sure to always tape it to your surface before starting. To paint with watercolors, simply dip your brush into clean water. If you're using pans, activate the pigments with the water of your brush. You can also use a spray bottle for this. Take some of the paint and put it into the desired area. If you're using tubes, squeeze out an amount, give it a little mix with a wet clean brush and also apply it to the desired area. If you want to mix the color, because none of the bought ones are the right shade, simply do the same thing we just did, but instead of applying the paint to the paper, apply it into one of those palette pans. You can also use things like flat plates if you don't have a palette for mixing. Repeat and add more or less water to this mix until you have the color that you wanted. Make sure to swatch it on your paper sheet before applying it to your actual painting. Congrats! You just learned the basic of how to use watercolors. Let's try painting something. I always advise people who want to start working with a new art medium to start with very simple shapes, like squares or cubes. Let's start with the square. We make a very simple circle with a pencil and decide where the shadow and where the light goes. Since I know where to add the shadow, aka the darker area, I will start applying my paint there. For this technique, try not to work with a too thin and watery paint mix. I will add my paint where the shadow is first, clean my brush, and then with the clean and wet brush will slightly brush over the edges of the just painted area, blending it all the way into a square shape. Congrats! You just blended out watercolors for the first time! Now let's sketch a cube, and think about the lighting situation again. We now have more surfaces than before with the square. Let's start with the lightest. Wait for it to dry so the colors do not run into each other this time, and then apply another color to a more dark area. Repeat this until the cube is done. So how about we do a simple but more advanced shape together? Let's do the most cliché painting ever. A painting of a fruit. I picked an apple. For this exercise I will introduce you to the different techniques of watercolors. The most common and more important ones are, for example, wet on dry and wet on wet. Let's start with wet on dry, aka my favorite technique. We have our round shape and an idea of the lights and shadows. I will start with the lightest color, as advised for watercolors, since you cannot paint lighter colors over darker ones. So basically, once you paint it over an area, it is there. However, if your paint is still wet, you can dab it off gently and without rubbing with a tissue. Once it dries, add the second lightest color, but do not apply it over the very lightest point of your painting. You can, though, if you blend it out enough, that the lightest area still stays as light. Wait again for this to dry and repeat it over and over until you have reached the desired values, colors, shadows, or whatever you wanted to achieve. If you do not like to shade as much, nor want to work with lights and colors, you can also use a more flat painting style by, well, just adding the paint and letting it dry, eventually adding some details, and that's it. Now for the wet and wet technique, we are going to apply a layer of clean water over our subject. The colors of your watercolors will stay inside the now wet area, which means that you can now add the colors, both light and dark, and let the water and pigments do their own thing to blend together. After every dry layer, gently wet it again and repeat. This technique can create amazingly smooth effects and blendings. You can also obviously mix both techniques. A popular thing, for example, is to start with the wet and wet technique, wait for it to dry, and then go over it again for some details. There are tons of art styles, techniques, and personal preferences, so please just do whatever you want to create. There are no don'ts in painting. Feel free to be as creative as you want. Go abstract, go realistic, go cartoon, do what makes you happy. But use watercolor paper for watercolors. That's the one rule never to be broken, promise me. Talking about rules, who said you can't add other mediums to your paintings? Well, actually no one, but I needed a reason to go to the next lesson. Mixed media. Mixed media means using more than just one medium. So in our case, more than just watercolors. A popular addition can, for example, be colored pencils. You can just go over your watercolor artworks with them for more shading or more detailed work. White gel pens or white ink are popular additions for adding white highlights afterwards. Gouache, to say it simple, opaque form of watercolors, can be applied over your watercolors, even light colors as beige or white. Experiment with different mediums and techniques as much as possible to get a feeling of how watercolors work and how you can make the best out of your ideas. I hope this tutorial was helpful to you. I have written down all of my personal watercolor supplies if you're curious what I'm using. If you have any other questions or are interested in watching me create my own paintings, you can join me in my live streams on Twitch or follow me on Patreon for complete time lapses. I wish you much fun with trying out watercolors.